Cool, so let's go ahead and kick off. Thank you so much for having me. I am Tiffany, really happy to be here. Let's go ahead and jump in. So today in this presentation, I'm going to go over, first of all, just a couple of basics. What is community operations and what kind of tasks and responsibilities does a CommOps person do? Next, I'm going to go into how to build a business case and actually pitch hiring a community operations person on your team and really adding that value to not only the community team, but the organization as a whole. And then going over furthering down the process a little bit, things to consider when looking to hire a community operations person. So if you are the leader or head of community team, this is a really useful session for you to help strategize and start thinking about maybe the next stage or evolution of your team. And if you're a community manager, this would be a really good session for you to kind of learn a little bit more about community operations if you're interested in maybe transitioning or learning about it for the next stage of your career. So let's go ahead and jump in. Starting off with a quick little summary about me. I had a great intro, so thank you so much. I'm based in San Francisco. I am the Director of Community Operations for a company in machine identity management called Venafi. And before that, I was the Senior Program Manager for Salesforce's Trailblazer Community team. And before that, I had a bunch of different roles, ranging from being a project manager and a program manager to wearing a dozen different hats at startups, being in marketing, customer support, customer experience, you kind of name it. You know, you're wearing all the hats when you're working at startups. And I want to call that out because there are roles that really culminated into the perfect storm of community operations. And I'll bring that up a little bit later when we start talking about hiring for a CommOps person. Couple fun communities I'm in, that is my Shiba Inu Yoshi, and I am part of a couple different Shiba communities up here in Northern California. And I also love checking out new restaurants. I'm a huge foodie, so I'm a big fan of the Google Local Guides community as well. So, all right, with that, community operations, it's not new. If you are a community that's been around for a while, or you've scaled and grown, or you have platforms that you use, you wouldn't have gotten to where you are today without CommOps. But it's still kind of an ambiguous term, pretty nascent, I think, in the industry. And so I just want to take a second, go back to basics and talk about what community operations is. And I'd like to use a restaurant analogy. You might have heard me use this before if you've heard me speak, but in a restaurant, you have the front of the house, and these are the patrons. These are the guests who are coming to eat. And in this analogy, those are your community members. Then you also have the people who are working at the restaurant who are front-facing and engaging and interacting with the customers. And these are your community moderators, your community managers, people who are engaging with your community members. You also have the back of the house. And these are people who are like the executive chef, the line cooks, the sous chefs. They're people behind the scenes prepping the food to bring out to the customers. And in a community team sense, this isn't only community managers per se, but also partners and stakeholders of community within your company. So like your developers, your IT, your marketing team, your creative team, people who are doing work for the community, but maybe behind the scenes. Then you also have the restaurant general manager, and this person has a leg on both sides of the state line, I guess you can say. So they are in the back of the house. They are checking, the plating before it goes out. They're expediting any dishes that might get, caught up in the line. They're also in the front of the house, making sure, going table to table, asking people how their meals are and their experiences, making sure wait times, for people waiting for tables are being accurate. And they really have a pulse on how both sides of the house are doing. And this is very similar to community operations. You're doing things both behind the scenes and front of the scenes and keeping both back of the house and front of the house in mind at all times. And you're like, okay, cool, Tiff, like restaurant, I get it, but what does that actually mean? So this is a very high level breakdown of just some of the things that a community operations person could do on a regular basis. And as I walk through these, I want everyone to think about the front of the house and the back of the house, the internal and the external aspects. So for example, with process, an internal thing could be, what is your community manager's daily moderation process? Or maybe an escalation process. And externally, maybe it's a user group leader's process to create a new event. So in that mindset, looking for improvement areas, bottlenecks, where are they getting stuck? Where are they kind of, spending the majority of their time trying to get through the process? And looking for areas where it could become more efficient and maybe even automate it. Similarly with programs, I'm looking for ways to scale and maintain the programs. Situations and circumstances are always changing, like COVID, for example. So making sure your programs are staying up to date and can also scale as your community grows. Part of that's policies and guidelines, working or partnering with the legal team, making sure the policies and guidelines are covering all different aspects, maybe any exception cases. We had to, modify policies and guidelines when COVID happened, for example, and focus a little bit more on virtual events. And then documentation, so internal documentation. Do your community managers know where to go? Do they have help articles and resources on various steps that they need to take, as well as documentation externally for your community members? Do they know what to do? Do they have resources handy? And then tech stack. Big part of community operations, as all of you know, working to make sure that the architecture, the landscape is set, all the integrations are good, looking for feature enhancements and improvements for both, again, tech stack that your community team uses, as well as your community members. If they're logging into your platform or logging into an event management platform or what have you, do they have the resources? Is the experience smooth for them as well? And then reporting, making sure you are able to report on the health of your community, looking for trends, looking for behaviors, and making sure that you have data integrity as well. And then run the business. These are kind of just everyday things that I do on a regular basis, as should any community operations person. So community roadmap, looking ahead, looking at your strategy, what events, what initiatives, what programs and things are happening and when relative to one another, and making sure that strategy is set in place. Also budget, if you are managing the tech stack, you'll most likely be responsible for a large chunk of your community team's budget. So just making sure you stay on track there. And then feedback cycles, making sure to listen to the customer or the community members, making sure to listen to your community team members, getting feedback, always looking for ways to improve, whether it's process, programs, et cetera. And then miscellaneous, these are kind of the ad hoc things that might get thrown at you, whether you're helping to run logistics at an event, whether or not you're looking to, do some sort of surprise and delight initiative for your community members or your community leaders. And then innovating always has some operational component to it as well. Like, will it work? How do we measure success? How are we going to be, doing whatever the program or the initiative is? You'll be looped into that. So if you're a community manager, you might be thinking like, wait, well, I do a lot of these things. And that would be good to bring up to your manager if you're looking to transition into community operations of things that you're already excelling in doing. And you also might be thinking like, wait a second, tech stack, like so-and-so on this team does this. And that's totally okay. You can make the decision to keep it as is and have another team help with that. I mean, we'll take help wherever we can get it, right? Or it might make better sense to bring that into your team. That would give you more autonomy and more control over maybe something like a dev timeline or a budget line. And if that's the case, you could talk to that person and get buy-in on what they think would help them as well. It never hurts to get support and buy-in and alignment from other partnering teams. All right. So needed to throw in another Yoshi pick there. Let's say you're interested in diving in a bit more. You are a community manager who's interested in learning more about community operations, or maybe you're looking to bring someone in on your team. The next couple slides, I'm going to go over things that you can do to include in a business case to show why and how having dedicated community operations person on your community team would add value to not only the team, but your company. And the reason this is important is because you really want to be prepared to show those benefits and the value of bringing the person on board. So let's go ahead and jump in. First of all, you want to show measured value. And one of the ways that you can do this is to add a quantitative number to a qualitative process. So first, just write down the processes or tasks that you do repeatedly multiple times, and you choose the cadence multiple times a day, multiple times a week, multiple times a month, etc. Now, how many times do you do this process? So you can get scrappy and literally just take a piece of paper and a pen and tally how many times you're doing this process, whatever cadence you choose. Or maybe you already have a report set up that will show you how many times that process or task is done. And if you don't, it's kind of a catch-22 that you might need a community operations person, but we'll talk about that later. Next, look into how much time it takes to do that process one time. By that, I mean take a stopwatch and time yourself doing it at a normal pace. Maybe do it a couple times just to get a good average, because I know when I'm using a stopwatch, I tend to go a little bit faster and race myself. Lastly, calculate cumulatively how much time it takes you, it's a little math, to do this on that cadence. So for this process, I'm spending 12 hours a month. That way you can actually see how much the process is costing you, both in time, and you can even take it one step further and look at how much money it's costing you and your team to do X process, every month. So from here, you'll have a good baseline of existing and historical. So, right now it's taking our team 20 hours a month to do this. You could even take it one step further if you have projected growth for your community by looking into how much more time and how much more money it would take, in the next quarter or in the next year. So when you look at all the processes across all your team members and add that quantitative measure like minutes, hours, or dollars to each process, it becomes really eye-opening on how much these manual or unoptimized processes really costs. Just one quick example before we move on. At Salesforce, we received over 90 user group leader applications a month. And it took our community coordinator about 20 minutes per application to review. That's 1,800 minutes or 30 hours a month that she was just spending on looking at applications. With community operations, we were able to automate a lot of that process and bring it down to 3 minutes per application. That is an 85% optimization. Another thing you can do is to create a fairly detailed community roadmap and do some capacity planning to show, first of all the things your team is currently doing. Secondly, how long each thing will take, when they're taking place relative to one another, and then show what is possible to do with your current team and current headcount. What isn't possible, but what maybe could be possible with additional resources. So planning as a team, you can think about the goals that you want to achieve, maybe milestones you want to reach, and all the things that need to be done in order to achieve those goals or milestones. And you can think wider than just your team's objectives too. These should ultimately be tied up to either the larger team that your community sits on and even the company-wide goals. Then you can list out all the major initiatives and high-level tasks and then determine the timeline and duration for each and actually split them among hours across your team. So for example, this initiative will be taking place in Q2. It will take about 40 hours across the quarter to complete. And of these 40 hours, these are the actual hour breakdowns of all of your team members. Because with this, it will provide a very clear view of what really is and isn't possible to do with your current headcount. So for example, you know that there's 40 hours in a work week. Subtract time for meetings, trainings, all hands calls. Even this week, I have 15 hours of trainings that I have to sit through. And with that, you actually see you have way less than 40 hours. Let's say you have 30 hours to work. With the roadmap exercise, you can very clearly see if your team's overloaded when, like you say that, this team member has 50 hours of work a week. What do you do with that extra 20? Well, you can either take it off and that project or initiative doesn't get done, or you can propose adding new team members to take on, that additional hours worth of work across your team and across the roadmap items that you have. So whereas measuring value is more on kind of existing and historical data with maybe a touch of that forecasting, road mapping is really future looking, and it's important to consider that whole spectrum as you're looking for your business case. And that's kind of vague, so I just wanted to provide a couple actual screenshots. Our team did a road mapping exercise a little while ago, and it really does take a lot of time, honestly, but it was a great team exercise. I definitely recommend, not only for your business case, but just to do it, at the start of the year during an offsite or a brainstorming session. Do it annually and revisit it frequently, especially on a monthly or maybe a quarterly basis. Also, the results are super valuable. It helps with prioritization, it helps with timing, resource allocation, and it's also easy to sum up and show your leadership team or your exec team. All right, another area that you can add to your business case pertains to community feedback. So if you've put out a feedback survey lately, or a pulse survey, I'd actually recommend going through the results again, but put your operations hat on. You can look for pain points on things like processes, documentation, ease of finding resources, feature requests on the platforms, program updates, general complaints or feedback. There's a ton of information that you could use, especially when you have that hat on. And if you haven't put out a feedback survey lately, number one, you should do one. But number two, when you do, it's actually a great opportunity to incorporate operational pieces and operational questions in it to get feedback. So that way you can ask about processes like, oh, you've gone through this process. How was that experience for you? Or, do you have any, do you have any feedback on, the platforms? Or, you can add operational questions to get feedback that would then be things that you can include in your roadmap or in your business case. All right. And then lastly, for feedback internally, you can, I don't think you need a feedback survey for your team per se, but you should always be asking for feedback. If they've gone through something, how is that experience for them? Where are they spending the majority of their time? You want to be a huge asset to your team members internally as well as externally. Tech stack, huge part of community operations. There's a ton here. So first of all, looking across the platforms that you currently use, are there any gaps that might be solved with a new platform? Have you been hearing feedback about bugs or feature enhancements on an existing platform? Are there maybe any peripheral tools or resources that would add a lot of value to your community? And by peripheral tools, I mean maybe not the big ticket items like your CRM or your event management platform, but maybe some widget or some supplemental tool, or maybe it's a Zapier integration. And are your platforms talking to each other? Are data and processes flowing seamlessly from one to another, or are they really disparate siloed systems? And then looking to kind of like organizational relationships, who's currently managing the relationships that you have with your CSMs, with your vendors? So if you're a community manager or leading your community team, are you the one who's sitting in the weekly or monthly check-in calls with your CSM? Because that actually adds up a lot of time, especially when you think about, scheduling, thinking about what to talk about, tracking all the bugs and feature enhancements that you're trying to get added on their roadmap. It takes a lot of time and focus. And that could be something that you're doing that's taking time away from you doing something else. And then lastly, if you have engineering support, whether it's maybe a dedicated developer or a shared services team, are you the one who's managing that relationship? Are you the one who's sharing the business requirements with them, fitting it into their roadmap and sprints, doing QA and testing, providing guidance, helping to do that knowledge transfer and implement it? Because that's a lot of work, and that's an ongoing relationship that, again, takes a lot of time and focus. All right. Kind of tangential to tech stack and platforms is general community health and metrics and reports. So looking across your reports and dashboards, do you have everything that you need? For example, when we were going and counting how many times we're doing that process, did you have a report for that? Or are you doing the sticky note and the pen and paper and tally? I think it's also really important to distinguish between an internal and an external metric. So we all know the general community metrics like the active members, engagement, number of monthly user group meetings, things like that. But there's also a bunch of internal reports, one that might not be as glamour and glitzy as member data, but still equally as important. Like, for example, geographic trends, or maybe swag orders and inventory tracking and budgeting. Not something that you'd really present to show on, to show off your community, but definitely something you should be tracking and watching on the back end. Also, are reports and dashboards easily and automatically made? Are you taking a couple numbers here, taking a couple numbers here, throwing it into an Excel spreadsheet and trying to put together a report? Or do you have them readily made and easy for you? Also, do you trust the data? Do you have data integrity? Or do you have to provide excuses and caveats to why a number might not be correct on a report or dashboard? And then lastly, taking it to the next level, are there any items that you want to report on, but just haven't been able to, either due to the lack of data infrastructure, or maybe the data integrity is not there? Those are all things that could add to your roadmap and have a community operations person do. And to note, I don't think a community operations should necessarily be a data guru or a data analyst or be a pro at analytics. But what they should be able to do is help set up the data and reporting infrastructure in a way where they're able to consider the important metrics for the community team to be tracking and take that relative to the platforms and how they report and integrate with one another. And then you have the and everything else. So think about everything else. What other back of the house, maybe, someone actually mentioned this earlier in our session, like the invisible tasks that you're working on that take time away from you doing your job. So if you're a community leader or head of your community, what is taking time away from you leading your team or thinking higher level strategically for the future of your community? And if you're a community manager, what are you doing that's taking time away from you moderating and engaging with the community, from being that front of the house? You also want to consider all the things that you want to do but haven't really gotten to because the lack of bandwidth and resources. Those are the things that you add on your to-do list and then you don't do and you just push out week after week or month after month. Those are things that you can jot down and consider for a community operations person to do, depending on what it is. And then lastly, think more strategically about any potential gaps or risk areas that your community could face in the future. So for example, let's say you provide financial reimbursement for user group leaders when they host meetings. Maybe it's pizza and beer or a projector rental or a venue rental. Is there anyone on your team who is regularly reviewing this data to spot trends, maybe find an area of risk where the company could be losing money? Maybe someone's getting reimbursed for an incorrect currency, or maybe you notice some peculiar reimbursement patterns from a newly onboarded leader who needs a little bit more training during their onboarding process. Is there an audit process set in place where this information is being reviewed regularly to spot any inconsistencies or irregularities? And then don't forget the seasoning. So, every organization and every team is different. So all of the tips that I provided earlier might not apply to your team or your community, especially depending on what stage your community is in. So for example, if you're still early and young in your community, maybe you haven't had so much of that historical growing pains, but you can focus on the road mapping, the platforms, the reporting, the future looking things. And then coming down back to this restaurant analogy, don't forget the seasoning. It's not only important to do seasoning at the end, but you want to do it throughout the cooking process too. So throughout the process, think about team alignment, making sure you've gotten buy-in from your team members throughout the process. So everything that I showed, talk to your team members about it, get their input. They might be doing something that they just thought is part of their job, but is something that, might be taking them away from being able to focus on what they're supposed to be doing. You also want clarity when this new person comes on board, when you do have a community operations person, because it shows clarity in terms of where your team's members' roles and responsibilities are. And don't be a silo. This is with regards to other teams. Get other teams buy-in. Community touches so many different teams within an organization. So for example, if you have developers that help with community initiatives, something that I kind of touched upon earlier, get their input on what would help them better support community. Maybe they want you to sit in on, their stand-up meetings or provide more, QA and testing, or maybe they need help with some knowledge transfer and training. You can actually be transparent with them and let them know that you're looking to hire a community operations person because it helps to get their buy-in and helps to get them on board and they see value in it. And then most importantly, as you're looking to pitch your business case, is to remember to sell the value. So when you're getting exec buy-in, you want to think about the stakeholders, the other teams and people involved, and what benefits it will bring for them. What are they motivated by? What's their goals? And how will bringing a community operations person help them achieve those goals? So touching from my previous example, the engineering team, maybe they really wished they had more of your time. You haven't been able to provide it because you've been so busy with other things. Maybe your IT team would find value because the community operations person would help support the tech stack. And maybe your exec team, your head of sales, marketing, customer support, et cetera, would love that holistic picture of community and how it impacts the entire business by way of maybe an executive dashboard. And this is something the ops person can help create, manage, and maintain. All right. And lastly, time to hire. Let's jump ahead a little bit and let's say your business case was amazing. You've gotten approval to bring on a dedicated person, or maybe you're looking to start looking for a job in community operations. A couple things that I'd like to say here is Community operations is still a fairly new term, and you won't find too many people with community operations on their resumes, and that's 100% okay. There's so many applicable skill sets, just like my experience that I shared in my first slide, that could be easily applied to community operations. Just make sure they have a base understanding of what community is, whether it's being a part of a personal community, or maybe they've worked on a community team before. Look for someone with previous project management experience, someone who's organized, someone who's really good at time management. And also, importantly, that front of the house experience. Look for someone who's had customer facing roles, whether that's support, whether that's, customer experience, customer, I don't know, like a customer success manager. You want to look for someone who has all those different puzzle pieces to put everything together to make the whole. And lastly, this is my ask for all of you here today, is let's work to mainstream community operations together. Include the term in your job title. Point it out when you see someone has potential in the field. Have it as a dedicated swim lane on your team alongside other lanes like moderation and engagement. Talk about it as you talk and network with other people in the community industry. Huge shout out to CMX for adding community operations as its own swim lane this year too at the summit. Let's work on mainstreaming it together. And then with that, side note, I love to see business cases. So please do reach out if you have any success stories on hiring a community operations person, getting that business case approved, or if you've recently been hired as a community operations person. Love to hear from you. So please feel free to reach out. I'm at Tiffany Oda on LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm in the Community Operations CMX Slack channel. And I also co-lead a monthly meetup where we talk about ComOps called Community Observations. And there is a link to the community if you would like to join and attend a future meeting. And that's all from me. Thank you.
That was fantastic, really, really wonderful, and thank you very much for sharing all that information. And I've been following the questions and the comments. It really is probably one of the best community operations presentations ever. So much information and such a great flow. So thank you very much. Really, really happy to hear. So obviously that was at the expense of time, because we wanted to get the most of it. But we've had so many questions. I think it's just in the interest of respect. Of course, there's some solitary activities after this, like networking. So maybe we can steal a couple of minutes. But let's ask the most upvoted question from Joy Converse. I would love to hear an example of how our teams have transitioned to having a community operations manager, especially when most community managers are used to handling all these areas and more.
Right. So I think that's a key point is, a lot of community teams are a solo person. Like you are the community team. And I think that's why it's really important to be able to set that baseline and create that business case to bring on a dedicated community operations person. You want to think about your forte and what your strengths are. So, there are a lot of different, differentiating between that front of the house and back of the house. So with your time, are you better, and is your time better suited to work with the community members, to be engaging with them, to thinking about, engagement initiatives? Or do you need to set up that infrastructure for your community to be successful? Are you processing things manually? Are you doing repeated things so many times? Because that's kind of a pain point, and that's going to be a risk area for you and your team and the community as it grows and as it matures.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that answer. I think we've run out of time. So many really, really cool questions, but we can only answer so many of them. And thank you for your continued attention and really great contributions to this session. So Tiffany, once again, it's been wonderful having you here.
Thanks everyone.
Everyone.